Good afternoon, folks. We're going to get started in approximately 30 seconds. We'll just give the few last people to log in. So appreciate you joining us, and we'll get started in a moment. Okay, folks, we'll get started. Good afternoon. This is Jim Rovers speaking. I'm Senior Vice President with AFIMAC Global. What I wanted to do is just a quick introduction of myself. In terms of myself, I've been working with the organization here for the past 12 years, assisting organizations with a broad range of investigative support. And in today's world, we find ourselves more and more delving into the area of digital surveillance, open source investigations, as well as social media monitoring. So what we wanted to do with today's webinar is talk to you about potential pitfalls, threats, things of that nature. We've asked Lorenzo Lisi, a good friend to the company, to join us today. He's a lawyer with the firm Ad & Burles. And what we want to do at the end of the day is have Lorenzo introduce himself. And then what we want to do is walk through some of the things that you need to consider from a legal perspective, as well as some of the things that might be offered to you to help you down the road. And I apologize, Lorenzo, because I got your firm's name wrong.
Oh, no, that's okay. That's okay.
In terms of I'll let you introduce yourself.
Sure. So I'm Lorenzo Lisi. I'm a partner and the head of the Labor and Employment Law Group at Ad & Burles. We deal with a variety of different labor and anything that has to do from a management side and the labor and employment side, which is wrongful dismissal, union matters, injunctions, departing employees, health and safety, construction, any of that is what we do, but only on the side of management. I've been working with Jim for, I think, all of his 12 years, and we've gotten to know each other very well and have actually been in the trenches on a number of strikes together. So I know Jim pretty well, and I'm looking forward to doing this webinar with him. That's me. We'll be able to go through some of the issues with respect to social media in the workplace, which, as you know, has become a real hot button and very topical.
Thank you. So let's go through the agenda here quickly, and then we'll get started, folks. What we want to cover today is what is social media, definitions, some of the statistics behind social media, what's changing in your workplaces. I think that's very important. Also managing social media in the workplace, talk a little bit about strategies and approach. And then we want to also touch on privacy, use of information, what's permissible, and certainly there's been a lot of buzz in the media in terms of collection, usage, policies, procedures, as well as privacy, and we're going to delve into that today. And then we'll round out the tail end of the presentation by dealing with employee misconduct, so the actual investigation, discipline, and termination issues. And then what we're going to talk about is the life cycle of a social media investigation, what makes it come together, what makes it work, what kind of information you can glean from this. And then we'll finish off with Lorenzo covering best practices, policy considerations, practical tips. And what we hope to leave you with is a good understanding of where you probably need to be, as well as some options that you have should you have situations come your way down the road. So with that being said, Lorenzo, I'll turn it over to you.
Great. Thanks very much, Jim. We don't need an expansive definition of social media because it's become everything that's on the net, everything that's on your phone, everything that gets circulated. But a broad definition is a collection of online platforms and tools that you use to share content, profiles, opinions, insights, and experiences. It's on the slide, but remember this. The big part of this is all of those components of social media, whether they be profiles, opinions, insights, experiences, they all impact or can impact on an employee's experience in the workplace. That's where the rubber hits the road with respect to workplace issues. So we know it's a platform or tool, and we know it's the act of connecting, right? And we know in many ways social media became or has become how businesses join the conversation. And that's why many businesses have very robust social media platforms and policies so they can interact with whoever's out there. As a matter of fact, it's become the main way of interacting with your public.
What we're going to do now is run you through a quick video here, and I think what it really does, very powerful video that ties a bow around just what you've got coming at you in terms of social media and how it's really it really impacts us today. So I'll
look around. So much can change in a year. What will you make of 2016?
So folks, what we wanted to do with that video is just give you a graphic example of, hold on here, sorry.
But what about our bodies? Here are 5 crazy ways that social media and the internet are affecting your brain right now. Can't log off? Surprisingly, 5 to 10% of internet users are actually unable to control how much time they spend online.
Give me a second.
Though it's a psychological addiction as opposed to a substance addiction, brain scans of these people actually show a similar impairment of regions that those with drug dependence have. Specifically, there's a clear degradation of white matter in the regions that control emotional processing, attention, and decision-making. Because social media provides immediate rewards with very little effort required, your brain begins to rewire itself.
What if you could see what people are saying?
Apologize, folks. Computer glitch. Sorry about that. So, again, wanted to provide you with a graphic example of what the world of social media looks like, and from Lorenzo's and I context, it talked a lot about marketing, brand, things of that nature. But I think what's important is the amount of data that your employees put on social media networks is absolutely astounding, and as well as the amount of information found on the open source or World Wide Web through blogs and other posts continues to grow at an exponential rate. And I'll turn it back over to you, Lorenzo.
Sure, thanks, Jim. We know that boomers and boomerangs in particular are voracious users of online media, and millennials really don't know a world without the internet, and particularly are so adept, and this is the younger generation, are so adept at using social media from their personal computers or their phones that even emails now are considered to be out of date and old-fashioned. Nobody communicates by email anymore, other than businesses for essential communication. But the younger generation doesn't, and that's something that we have to adapt to from a business perspective. Look at the stats. 1 in 9 people are members on Facebook. That is only growing, and it's growing quickly. Twitter adds 500,000 users per day. My expectation is that something will replace Twitter eventually, and it'll grow just as quickly. YouTube is unbelievably popular and grows exponentially. LinkedIn, from a business perspective, creates all kinds of issues, both from a networking perspective, not so much an issue, but a business tool, but does create issues with respect to, for example, departing employees. We know that that's the case. We're going to talk about that in a little bit. And look at those 3,000 pictures are added to Flickr each minute. That's incredible. And if we go and if we look at how that impacts on the workplace, there's a time consumption issue. Does it reduce productivity? Well, when the internet first came to the office, it did. There's no question. And so employers tried to limit the amount of time that an employee spent on the internet, or restricted use on their computer. That computer is now in their pocket. So if you tell an employee that they cannot use the internet on their computer, they'll just go to their iPhone, and that makes a big difference. So we need to understand that everybody does it. How do we manage it? It's not eliminating it. You can't make it verboten. You have to manage it. The problem with social media is that there is often, particularly amongst millennials and the younger generations, a real desire to share too much information. And once it's gone, it's gone. You can't get it back. It's also what I call mean media, which means specifically employees or individuals generally are much more apt to say things that they wouldn't say to you face-to-face, and that gets out on social media. That becomes both a distraction and a concern for companies, and that carelessness of thought. This has been a huge issue from a legal perspective, because we often find that individuals might say things about companies on social media, which would in turn either create liability or even provide confidential information that shouldn't have been disclosed.
The other thing, and I'll just add to the careless thought piece of things, recently we had a client who had hired an employee. They uncovered a number of lifestyle issues, very prominent brands, so use of narcotics, posting pictures on Instagram, and the employee probably thought at the end of the day, here's what I'm doing at home, how do I draw the connection? But as you know, Lorenzo, organizations with popular brands, it was like, we've got to go into damage control on this one, where the actual individual was kind of like, hey, I didn't even think I did anything.
Exactly. We're going to talk a little bit about that, Jim. because that's a very real problem amongst businesses, and managing that becomes the issue. So when you look at your strategy and approach, you can't eliminate access to smartphones and tablets. It's not going to happen. There are morale issues if you do that amongst particularly your younger generation, the people you are trying to recruit. And recruitment issues in social media are a whole different ballgame. We could do a 1-hour seminar or even a half-day seminar on that alone. But when you're dealing with Generation Y or millennials, you need to understand that this is their way of life. If your company does not adapt, they're not coming to your company. There's going to be an intellectual drain on your company by not being able to attract the best people. So we talk about a social media policy. What's it going to look like? I've seen them from 4 paragraphs to 14 pages. What does your company do? What does it want to do? How does it want to be perceived? What are the rules?
On the recruitment side, I'm just going to jump in for a sec, Lorenzo. We are finding more and more companies running very surface level basic searches on individuals. You're finding issues related to substance abuse, bullying mindset. You're finding individuals that may be racist or have racist thoughts or comments, as well as weapons. So your traditional background is not, there's no criminal record. Education is valid in a way, go that way. But you, at the end of the day, could bring somebody toxic to your workplace without knowing it.
And the other thing on that, go ahead and you can change the slide, but the other thing on that is that let's say that you have an employee, you look into social media, and that employee has not done anything wrong, but they are members of certain cultural or community groups which you think are problematic. Well, now you can't undo your knowledge of that information. You need to separate between the person who does that digging and the person who makes the decision, so that it's not relayed to them, or you might have a human rights concern in terms of not hiring them.
Absolutely.
So when you look at managing social media in the workplace, you look at mobile phone numbers, and these statistics aren't even up to 2016, but you'll see that men and women are equal, and look at the age difference there in terms of social networking. It's really skewed to the bottom, but it's increasing in older ages, both on race, ethnicity, these are American numbers because we probably wouldn't do them here in Canada, and household income. And you'll see that less than $30,000 per year is not significantly less than the people who are making plus $75,000, which means access to social media, because of the cost of phones, the relative low cost of phones, is easy, and that also applies to education levels as well.
As Lorenzo touched on earlier, and I think what's important, I've got a teenage daughter. Facebook is no longer cool. Their thing of choice right now, she does everything on Instagram
or Snapchat or
right, and tomorrow there'll be something else invented, and away it goes. So what's funny is my mother's taken to Facebook at almost 75 years old recently. So we're going to see people using different platforms for different things, but it's going to continue to grow and grow.
When we look at use by age group, again, social networking site use, well, you can see obviously that it's skewed towards the younger generation, but you can also see that it's increasing all the way up. The trends are specific, that all age groups are moving upwards, not just the younger ones. And then the percentage of online adults who use social media, well, there's some of the big ones: Facebook, LinkedIn, Pinterest, Twitter, and Instagram. And you can see Facebook obviously being big, and from the 2013 numbers, right? You can see that they're increasing on all areas as well. So it's, again, the statistics bear out what we're seeing on a usage basis. So how do we manage it? How does a business look at this and say, we've got a bit of a tempest in a teapot. How do we do it? Well, you need to think practically. We're going to talk about that. You need to worry about human rights, and we touched on those a little bit on recruitment. There are ethical issues on how you deal with information that comes through social media. And you need to the extent that you can, minimize your liability by social networking and social media policies which delineate and define usage in the company environment. Very important you do that. So, moving on to privacy and use of information now. We know that there are all kinds of little acronym privacy legislations: FIPA, MFIPA, and of course PIPEDA. We also know that when it comes to the transfer of information, particularly if it's commercial information, these govern. Some provinces have privacy information that governs employment, others don't. Ontario does not. But if you transfer that information, then it becomes an issue. So we know that from the perspective of what you know and what you want to know and what you keep, if you're going to share information which comes to you, and particularly if it goes cross-border, you need to worry about privacy issues. Well, what is the employee's expectation of privacy on any of these? Is it all fair game? What if there is conduct like violation of human rights legislation or disparagement which is online, or even copyright and intellectual property violations of company policies? These are becoming more and more prevalent. In other words, I had a client who had an individual do an interview for a trade magazine. And while they were doing the interview for the trade magazine, disclosed information about a product which had yet to be released. Now, he or she thought that that was perfectly fine, but it wasn't, and it led to the termination of their employment. And that was something that, you know, the company encouraged, but encouraged within specific boundaries. So again, we need to be concerned about that. What are our employees doing? What do they know they can and cannot do?
I think just to add to what Lorenzo said, and I like to use live examples, we do some work with a large manufacturing firm. They had an employee that had to make a trip to the Ukraine, actively took to Facebook talking about, you know, here's where I'm going, my flight's taking off, I landed, here's where I'm going to eat, all those other wonderful things that people like to do. And on about day 3 of the trip, was intercepted by somebody that they're not sure if it was a government official, but it started down the path of, why are you in our country? What are you doing? What is the purpose of your business? And needless to say, the employee phoned back kind of panicked, saying, oh my God, I think I've done something horribly wrong. And they didn't have a lot of the things in policies, procedures that Lorenzo's talked about, and he had given away the fact that they were on a business junket, and away it goes. So that's how simple a piece of information or information, groups of information can hurt you.
So what's appropriate and what's not appropriate? Here's what we know is permissible. And a lot of this is evolving through the case law, and a lot of it evolves through case law where there are unions and management, because arbitrations get done much quicker than court cases do, or privacy decisions. So what we're finding is arbitrators at first instance are dealing with a lot of these issues, and they're dealing with them quickly. You get a decision within a couple of months, it's done, it becomes part of the law. So Facebook content, tweets, blog posts, even postings that do not directly or indirectly affect the workplace are fine. Content that promotes the company in accordance with the goals, directives, and policies, providing they are set out, that's also fine. But what's not permissible? Well, if they directly or indirectly affect the workplace in a negative or derogatory fashion, derogatory or defamatory content, period, is problematic. Content that violates the duty of faith and fidelity of its employees. I would say that the example I gave about the individual who inadvertently gave up product information is an example of that, even though it wasn't done directly. And content that violates conduct or confidentiality agreements. Really important that employees understand what the rules are. Where are the fences? Okay? So just to give you an example, an employee is free to do whatever he likes during his non-working time, and his social media comments are none of the employer's business. There's a but. There's always a but. If the comments pose a threat to the employer's business interests, then they become the employer's business, and that's when the employee becomes open to discipline or discharge. We're going to talk in a bit about the Ghomeshi saga, because that's a perfect example of how we're dealing with stuff. So when we look at these elements of misconduct, let's broadly phrase it as misconduct. We think of misconduct as telling off your supervisor, or getting in trouble with another employee, or doing something with a client that you shouldn't have done. But this is misconduct as well, even though it's on social media. We have to recalibrate, but we also don't forget the principles of discipline. So we investigate, right? We know we have to investigate. You don't do it differently than you investigate any other element of misconduct, all right? Is there a policy? Has the policy been applied? What, if any, discipline is appropriate, right? Reference the policies, make sure you comply with the investigation processes that are in there, and importantly, manage the fallout, because when you're dealing with social media, particularly if you have a younger workforce or anybody who's young in the workforce, they're going to see it as a direct attack as what they stand for. Well, what are you telling me, that you saw something on my Facebook and now I'm in trouble? If that's going to get around, you have to be prepared to communicate that before you issue the discipline. Be consistent, and sometimes, and most employers know what I'm talking about, you just say, look, we're not going to allege cause, we're just going to get rid of you, here's a package, we don't need to deal with this. Okay, so nothing changes that way.
Beautiful. So I'm going to jump in here and talk a little bit about the social media investigation life cycle. Legal often gets called, and they're the tip of the spear where you're calling saying, hey, I've got this potential issue, or I've heard of. And what the employer typically does next is scrambles to try to find this information, and often becomes frustrated, or it becomes extremely time consuming and maybe not thorough enough, or the evidence certainly hasn't been gathered in a format that's usable. So typically when we get a file in, what happens first is, just as Lorenzo said, if any of you have done a traditional type investigation or surveillance, there's intake on our end. And what we need to do is take in as much information as you have relating to the specific area of investigation. What we then do is, run that through various internet searches, and as well as through some technology that harvests in an automatic way. So when we talk about harvesting, what it's doing is we're going out and gathering information. This is not information that's gathered in a format, but we're pulling together. It does require breaking down an analysis, and from there, what we do is, once the analysis is completed, we essentially, enrich that data, and what we do is turn it into something that's usable. So one of the things you do get is a lot of false positives. So I can give you an example. We did a digital surveillance on an individual, and this was a workplace violence case. One of the key words that we had was kill. What repeatedly came up in our harvest was, had a killer day today. Do you know where I can get a killer hamburger? Killed it at hockey, scored 3 goals. So there is some massaging behind the scenes that needs to go on. But needless to say, anything where employees do not have their privacy settings locked down, and I think this is what's key. What you want to be able to do is use the information and not, get behind so-called firewalls or things of that nature. You want to be in a position where you're harvesting open source information. The other thing I'm going to say on the open source piece is, we know that about 20% of the information on the net is open source at this point in time. It's getting better each and every day, and the reason is those wonderful apps we have on our phone ask us if we'd like to turn our GPS location settings on, or things of that nature. If I use a recent investigation as an example, we had an individual we were getting very little information out of. However, whenever he got in his car and he used one of his driving apps, it opened up his locational setting, and also opened up some of the barriers to some of the information they were pushing out that we weren't seeing before. So there's a couple of examples of what takes place on our end. In terms of the applications, we do a tremendous amount of work for human resources groups, so they tend to be, as Lorenzo's described, people-related issues, benefit claims. We've had all kinds of wonderful photos and videos of people on vacation doing things that they shouldn't be doing. A lot of workplace violence, bullying also takes place over the net. And then there's a whole range of what we call compliance and ethics issue, theft, fraud, disparaging remarks, or racism, or things of that nature. Unfortunately, those situations tend to land with HR, and at the end of the day, they're tasked with, looking at that. From an overall corporate risk perspective, organizations are using technology more and more to fact find. They're using it, what I call, as a force multiplier. So oftentimes, for those of you in whatever line of work you're in, someone comes to you and says you need to get to the bottom of an issue. And short of you going out and starting to ask people, which will take that investigation from being something sensitive and quiet to essentially talking about it on a megaphone, this gives you the opportunity to pull some of the details together, maybe get you that nugget of information that you need to start to head down a path and help you structure your investigation. And in addition to that, may also help you structure your legal argument or your legal position. Okay. In terms of the due diligence side of things, again, we've talked about on the pre-employment side, doing your due diligence. More and more, we are finding that, we are working through vendors, partners, contractors, things of that nature. They all at some point become an extension of our organizations, our brands. They represent us. We've had on a number of occasions where the individual thought they had partnered with somebody that was reputable, only later to find out, oh my gosh, what have we done? So there's a tremendous amount of information that can be gleaned there. On the insurance side of things, obviously, insurance covers a whole host of areas, right from bodily injury through to property claims, healthcare claims, and things of that nature. We are finding more and more that prior to deploying physical surveillance, detailed social media type investigations are being done, as well as harvesting of open source intelligence. I'll give you a live example just to help separate the two bundles. We had a situation here last week where we came up with very little with respect to a claimant on social media. However, upon doing some open source web searches and using various tools that we have, we identified that the individual was being highlighted as a yoga instructor, was being brought in for a special series of lessons at a particular yoga studio, being put out on blogs, other information, and then it allowed us to connect some other things that way and link things up. So keep that in mind. And then lastly, on the loss prevention side of things, for those of you in loss prevention, you're constantly dealing with theft, fraud, counterfeiting. I don't think I need to belabor the point. If you want to find or buy something or do something, chances are you can purchase it online with a credit card on the internet. And again, law firms working with folks like Lorenzo, typically when they have a client case come in and working away. Interestingly, getting more and more work out of educational institutes with respect to bullying, threats. We've seen a lot of active shooter incidents, and what we typically see at the end of the day with active shooter is CNN pulls the post up that says, oh, here's what the guy was talking about 2 weeks ago, and look at the pictures. We're having organizations now triage individuals that pose a risk, starting to look at them a little further out, maybe working with them from a counseling perspective. There may be some mental health issues or other issues, and rather than reacting, being more proactive and upfront on the front end. And to Lorenzo's piece earlier, with some of the monitoring and things that go on, rather than talk about the harsh discipline side of things, you still may need to get legal counsel in terms of crafting policies and procedures, but maybe you're having more of a discussion around corrective action or tightening some other things up, or last chance agreements versus heading down the termination route. Very quickly on the social media in terms of as a tool, you'll look at the rings here, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on each ring, but as you can see in the very outer ring, there are technologies in place that we utilize that we can actually geofence a location and harvest data coming in from that location. So as an example, we could take Times Square in New York City or the CN Tower downtown Toronto or wherever you may be, geofence that and start to pull in key social media information surrounding that particular area. We could also do what's called a social media footprint search, and that is a very basic level search that will drill down into the individual's footprint or non-footprint, and give you a snapshot into what their last 10 posts look like on the 9 most social media platforms. And then next in the evolution is an actual digital surveillance. So quite often we're being called upon where they're saying we have an individual named John Doe. I'll give you a live example. After the Paris attacks, we were contacted by a mining company. They had a Muslim employee come forward and say that he had received threats by a coworker that were verbal in nature. However, in questioning, of course, nobody heard or saw anything. They asked us to run a 30-day digital surveillance on the individual who had made the threats. What we were able to pull up is the last 100 posts on the various platforms, as well as putting alerts around certain keywords. This was not an isolated incident that just happened with the Paris attacks. It was more the trigger that lit the fuse, and we were able to uncover quite a comprehensive amount of information that they in turn got over to their legal and said, we're dealing with some information here that's not good for business, does not meet with our compliance ethics, has broken our policies, and now someone like Lorenzo, how do we find a way to exit out of this? And then lastly, sometimes traditional surveillance or investigative methods are utilized. But again, what we find is a lot of surveillance work done, if you're not doing your social media and open source investigative work, you're essentially looking for a needle in a haystack, and you can burn through considerable dollars. And I'm sure for some of you on the phone, you've been through those experiences where, you know, $3,000 to $5,000 later, you're wondering, why did I do this? At the end of the day, you can choose to spend your money more wisely, and you may, as an example, know, hey, every Wednesday night the guy posts pictures from a bar, you know, drinking beer and eating chicken wings after his hockey game. Wednesday's probably a good day to maybe have a look at that individual after hours versus the other days of the week. Okay, I'm going to turn it back over to Lorenzo now to talk about some of the considerations upon termination.
So we're faced as legal with dealing with our human resource clients and saying, look, here's the information that we have. Here's what we've called. Here's what we've asked guys like Jim to do and bring back to us. And here's what we got. What do we do with it? Well, we need to look at a couple things tactically and strategically. First is, do you want to go without cause or do you want to go with cause? We know cause is very difficult to prove, but oftentimes that's not really the issue. We want to make sure that when we terminate somebody, we ensure that there's non-disclosure of secrets from the company, confidential information, or even the terms sometimes of a without cause settlement. We'll talk about that in generally, which is that if you give them a severance package, we don't want the world knowing. We don't want it posted on social media. Very interesting case with an author who Jan Wong, who sued the Globe and Mail and filed a human rights complaint. Ended up getting a settlement, but then ended up tweeting that she had got a settlement, which was in breach. Didn't say the specifics, but made reference to it, and the Globe and Mail took the position that it was a breach of the confidentiality provision of the settlement, and they won. She tried to have the decision judicially reviewed. She spent 10 times more than she won, but the court said, no, you promised you wouldn't say anything, and you did on social media. It was a problem. So we need to make sure that the documentation you have on the severance wraps up confidentiality issues, particularly on social media. My releases, my settlement documents all make reference explicitly to social media concerns. If you're going to go on cause, particularly if we've got issues like evidence of bullying and harassment, cyber sabotage, the stealing of secrets, the departure with information, which we often get through using surveillance, then we need to understand that that might go sideways and there might be a fallout from that employee taking the stuff and using it. We need to be very clear when we're making the termination decision that that's a risk. We need to manage that risk by ensuring that when you terminate, there's no access to anything and warning them of any breach of those confidentiality provisions. There's a case out there from a couple years back called Jones versus Sy. Really interesting case. Quickly, Jones was an employee of BMO. She had a personal account. Cy worked for a different BMO branch, and they didn't know each other, but Cy was in a common law relationship with Jones's former husband. Now, the case revealed that over the course of 4 years, Cy used her work computer and access in the BMO system to view Jones's personal banking on at least 174 occasions. I can tell you in 4 years, I haven't looked at my bank account on 174 occasions, right? So what we did is there was a complaint made, and it said that you can't look at my stuff. You can't breach my privacy. The court's problem was that BMO did nothing wrong. They had policies. They made sure people knew about their policies. They had done everything right. But the individual was still held liable. And the way they did it, the courts did it, is they created a new common law tort, which tort is just a legal word for an actionable wrong. And they called it intrusion upon seclusion, which you needed 3 elements to prove: a reckless intrusion into private affairs, no lawful justification, and objectively, and that's what the law is about, an objective standard, it was highly offensive and caused distress, humiliation, or anguish. There was only $10,000 in this case and a kind of a limit of up to $20,000 per claim, but this is going to grow. I can almost tell you for sure it's going to grow. There's an interesting case in Whitmar, and we talked about this earlier on. Employees leave a business. They start their own business, and they want to use their former employer's contact information. Well, what they did, and the employer found out by using surveillance, like social media surveillance, that they had taken client contact information from LinkedIn groups that one of the employees had administered. And note that the LinkedIn groups were invite-only and not public. Might be a different situation if they were public. Well, the court found that the employer had a proprietary interest in the client contact information and granted an injunction. That is the virtual Rolodex, okay? That's no different than somebody taking the Rolodex and using the contact information. So the courts are going to enforce that. Let's talk about Ghomeshi. When the Ghomeshi matter came up, I was actually at a hockey arena on a Sunday night at 8 o'clock, and I got a call from Canada AM. And they said, we want you to come on tomorrow at 7 in the morning to talk about the Ghomeshi Facebook post. And I said, well, what are you talking about? So I went in on my phone and I looked at it, and it was his long dissertation about the fact that, you know, what was going to come down through the media. He was trying to get around ahead of the media on this. And when you look at what happened immediately, there was 90,000 likes and shared 37,000 times and almost 22,000 comments on this. Now, this has changed since then, we know. But the Star published the allegations of civil action. When I was interviewed in Canada AM, I said, the civil action's got no legs. He's a union member. He can only make a collective agreement grievance, right? But he brought this huge lawsuit, which ultimately was withdrawn, and he paid $18,000 in costs. The union grievance has not yet been settled, but the criminal sexual assault charges are working their way through the courtroom. What's interesting about this case, you know, we know that he's on bail. He's basically on house arrest. What is interesting about this case is that his management of social media was really poor. For a guy who lived on social media, he misstepped, and maybe it was advice and maybe it wasn't, but bringing the lawsuit, number one, or threatening the lawsuit was a bad idea. Trying to get out in front of it, they actually will use his Facebook post as evidence in the sexual assault hearing because he admits to stuff on there. So this is a perfect example of how things can get outside and go downhill very quickly. CBC and the Rubin report has been roundly criticized for their decision to allow him to work above the law within their own policies, both in terms of sexual harassment and social media. So it's a big issue. This is an interesting one, just a real quick one. This is in the States. You know, everybody gets elected, even the garbage collectors. The sheriff refused to reappoint employees who supported their opponent for re-election by liking the opponent on the sheriff's Facebook page. And you would say, well, that can't possibly be an issue. But the court held that by doing so, it was like putting a sign on your front lawn that likes the person who's the opponent of the person you work for, right? So they looked at the Facebook like as a element of substantive free speech. That would not be, I don't think that would be decided the same in Canada, but it shows where we're going. So when we're talking about improper use of social media, we know that particularly in Ontario, but everywhere across Canada, there is legislation, and we know the old Bill 168, the violence, harassment, and bullying, and we know that Bill 132 is coming out, which is going to refine that even further. employers are under obligation to ensure a workplace free of bullying harassment. Well, you know where that happens mostly now. It happens on Facebook. It happens on social media. It happens on Instagram. We're struggling with, just had a client recently who terminated as a result of employees' Facebook pages where they were making derogatory, racist, and offensive remarks of other employees on their own Facebook page, on Facebook pages they created, right? So they weren't even attributed to them. Now, by investigation, we could get back to it pretty quickly on who did it, right? But really what we're looking at is take a look at what's the nature of the comment in the context of the posting, right? Is it related to the workplace? Has it impacted other people? Is there something defamatory or derogatory? Has the employee been contrite? Have they cooperated? Have they rendered an apology? And what are the consequences of improper use, particularly in the public eye? So we know this one, the Ontario Hydro guy. Remember the city reporter? He came up and he made that kind of vulgar remark. Actually, he didn't make it, but he was then interviewed on it, and he got fired by Hydro One. Now, anybody in the employment law field knew that that was not going to be upheld. What ended up happening is they reinstated him with basically all of that money as a penalty. But the problem was, it wasn't really an issue for cause. They wanted him out because of the impact of how that video went viral. They just got him out. They knew they likely didn't have cause, but they argued it. They just couldn't sustain it. Okay?
Absolutely. And I'll just throw this in, Lorenzo, as one point, and certainly add to it if you wish. We recently were engaged by an organization. They had a troubled individual that was dealing with an insurance claim issue with them. He had a disagreement over his return to work setup that they had with him. And interestingly, he went home and he merely took a picture of himself with a gun.
Yeah.
And on that post, he put at the bottom, "Sure hope my claim gets sorted out." Right?
Yikes.
The organization took that as, jeepers, there's maybe not a lot of words here, but there's certainly something that would cause us heartburn. It sure had startled some of the folks in the HR and claims area. So pictures and words do make up part of the equation. Now, interestingly, I'm sure, and I'm not a lawyer, the individual probably spun a great story in terms of what he meant or didn't mean with the holding of a weapon, but interesting.
So when you look at, we have the horrific story of the Virginia television reporter who was shot effectively on camera. The cameraman and her were shot on camera. And you recall that the individual who shot her was a disturbed employee who had gone through about 4 or 5 previous employers and was trying to make his way through the television industry in the area. He had some real mental health issues, but was consistently terminated, often without cause, and then left to go somewhere else. But the issue of his mental illness was never dealt with. So when he was effectively what he thought shunned in this, he made his final stand. This is an employer's nightmare, right? Each employer did what they thought was the right thing, but never dealt with the issue of the mental health, which was, if you look at the social media postings as they went on, was quite apparent. So this kind of gives you a view not only of the employer's view of this, but how the individual who had a mental disability thought that the best way to do this would be on open media. And that's what we're getting now, right? So there's this case of Perez Moreno. This is a little bit of a warning to employers. This was an employee who posted on their Facebook without the permission of the employer that she had been written up at work for calling a fellow employee a dirty Mexican. The applicant, who said this was a human rights violation, a classmate saw the Facebook post, and the applicant brought a complaint to the Human Rights Tribunal. Now, it wasn't the employer's fault, but they found that action by the employee of posting that on Facebook amounted to harassment in the workplace, contrary to the Human Rights Code. So we're broadening this definition, folks. It's very important that we understand through a social media policy, employees understand what's good, what's not good, what's allowable, what isn't. All right? So make sure your policy, right, has rules on what use is. What's used for, how can you use it for promoting your work, and what's appropriate non-work usage of social media. The policy should contain that kind of information. Comment on the nature of the media. right? Make sure that they understand that social media stuff that's out there, even Snapchats can be retained if you know how to do it, is eliminated. And many employers want to be very specific that you can't comment on company issues without authorization. Walmart had a real big problem in the States. They have an intranet, which is what employees use. You know how Walmart is about unionization, right? They pride themselves on being a non-union company, and they want to stay that way. Nothing illegal about that. The problem they had is that on the intranet, people were talking about unionization. So what do? Do you fire them? In Ontario, if you fire them, there's absolutely a remedy at the labor boards for doing this. What they had to do is they had to go in, they had to start kind of diffusing that conversation to move it out of the conversation amongst intranet users. This is a real problem. You can't put the genie back in the bottle.
Absolutely.
So what are the policy considerations? You can never, ever, ever disclose proprietary or confidential information. That should be deemed to be the basis for a terminable offense. The same with copyright and other legal issues. You cannot allow people to infringe copyright. But to do that, you're going to have to show that the employees understood that and understood the issues of confidential information. There has to be an expectation in the policy that they have to comply with laws and policies, which, by the way, include human rights legislation. And that's why training is incredibly important. Doing harassment training should include a component about social media. If you don't, you're falling short. Indicate that there's discipline for improper use, and that improper use can include harassment, and have a person that culls these questions. Make sure that there's one consistent voice by the company when responding to employees. So what are our tips? We're kind of wrapping it up now. Make sure that the policies address confidentiality and acceptable conduct. We can do that. You can coordinate this with your harassment policy. Okay? It can be part of it. Communicate what's acceptable. Make sure employees have notice of the policy they sign off on, whether it's via intranet or the old signature on a paper that you keep in a file, right? Be consistent in applying your policies. The death knell for the application of any policy is that you apply it inconsistently. Because I'll tell you what will happen. The whole policy will fall down. If you say one employee gets it and the other one doesn't, the policy is not good for anything. Establish a process for addressing social networking concerns. That means ask first, write later. That if somebody has a question, they have a go-to person who's designated to answer it in accordance with the policy of the company. And don't be afraid to discipline after providing an appropriate investigation. And the investigation can include Jim coming in and taking a look at exactly what's out there.
So just a couple things to tie a bow on this, and then we'll wrap it up for today. I think in our experience, here's what we find. Organizations have a good policy framework. Lorenzo touched on the enforcement of policy, monitoring or governance around that policy. The other thing I'd encourage you to do is spend some time on getting a proper reporting structure set up in place and get some definitions around what needs to be escalated and at what level what actions take place.
That's a good point. Very good point.
Because at the end of the day, I'll share a live example where it's graphic in nature, but an employee had walked into HR and had claimed that they had heard voices the day before. They had suffered some mental health issues and had a dream that evening that they had killed a coworker, broke into their house and killed them. The response from HR, believe it or not, in this case was, you need to contact your EAP provider immediately and work through that process. Seems all right. 2 weeks later, the employee meets back with HR and says it's gotten worse, but this time the dream I'm having relates to you and I'm harming you. What was interesting, take those two separate incidents, now it gets reported properly. Security's made aware, other folks in HR are made aware, the team sort of gets together, and then what they do is they work the process that they have in place, engaging legal. Yeah. What information do we need to pull in and away go that way? So I think in a lot of cases, people don't like to complain about other individuals, but we've seen a lot of horrific events happen in all countries where the term I like to use, if some security awareness was utilized in terms of that doesn't sound good, it doesn't make sense, it doesn't feel good, at least you've got it captured as an incident of some sort, and you can start to put strategies around how you want to manage that.
Yeah, very good point, Jim. And we're using differently now security and investigative tools than we have before. I think that's evolved over time. For example, we had an employee who on social media who had been terminated had made a threat. So rather than the old way would be to post a security guard at the front door, we all know though that if the person really wants to do something, right, they're going to barge in, and that security guard is not going to do anything. Usually, right, they're going to be at a real disadvantage. What we ended up doing was we ended up having the individual who made the threat followed with communication with the police, so that if that individual over the course of a couple of days after they issued the threat was getting near the workplace, or anybody who lived near the workplace that we knew, we contacted the police immediately. So the police became involved when it got close enough. There was action which was taken, and it actually we still had security in place at the employer, but we knew that we could get something more immediate with a 911 call through our security provider who got that done. So we're using it differently. We need to be smart about this, but we also need to look, where are the flags? How is social media being used? And is it relevant social media? We don't need, the sky isn't falling all the time. We need an assessment process, and I think that's what we can use guys like Jim for. So that's all I got for you today.
Good. Thank you, folks. So I appreciate you calling in and taking time out of your busy schedules. We will be distributing a copy of the webinar slide deck, as well as a recording of the webinar. And certainly, if you have questions following that distribution, please feel free to reach out to Lorenzo or myself on an individual basis. We'd be more than happy to address anything that you might need. Thank you. Have a great day.